Welcome back to this reading of Aurelia's Colors. I am reading this right after Christmas 2020, and I have come into my office here at Seattle Pacific for this reading, forgetting that they turn off the heat in these buildings because the buildings aren't being used much over the holiday break. So I'm going to leave my coat on for this reading. There's some cold-heartedness in this chapter, so maybe it's appropriate. This is chapter 12 of Aurelia's Colors, and it's called Stricia's View. By the way, if you're reading along, you may notice that I change a word, maybe two, in this chapter, because I am always looking for ways to improve and revise. I think any artist wants to do that, wants to improve even the things that have already been shared with others. So bonus points for you if you're reading along and you see the word that I revise as I read. Stricia's View. Suspended in a turret high above the ornamental wall around King Calmarcus's palace, the young woman who had been promised Geralaine's crown leaned on the battlement and watched a gull soar down into the palace courtyard. They'll all come into the courtyard soon. Breathless from her climb up the steps of the tower, Stricia scanned the crowds for friends, for enemies, for people to impress. They can't wait, the housefolk. Isn't it funny? Carbalter, the watchman standing beside her, snorted but said nothing. Stricia could read his silence. The housefolk, he must be thinking. You're still one of the housefolk. He would not dare utter such thoughts aloud. Stricia was not part of the royal family yet, but she would soon have the power to give him orders. He would stifle his discontent and strive to impress her. All the officers would. They wonder what goes on inside the palace, she continued. I'm glad my father is the captain. I get to see both sides of the wall. Do you find much of interest inside the palace wall? The watchman asked. She flinched, the question stinging like a fleck of dirt in her eye. This was a place of privilege, and she would climb higher soon. Anything close to a challenge, anything requiring her to question herself, was just a disruption. She kept her back turned to her questioner. But she knew the answer. As the wedding drew nearer, she found it more difficult to endure the company of housefolk. Each day she stepped carefully, training herself to speak nothing but that which would flatter the king, to manifest perfect adherence to Abascar law. The sight of the palace wall from without gave her a strange sense of foreboding, as if she might misstep, might spoil the dream she had worked so hard to make real. This wall of rugged stones and rippling crystal veins was the second barrier of the king's defense against attack, securing royalty, counselors, military, the king's stables and storehouses, and passage to the most protected chambers of the underkeep. And the history scrolls confirmed that no assailant had ever reached the palace. But then no enemies had ever breached Abascar's outermost wall of ash-gray brick either. Homes, schools, markets and mills, craft halls, training yards, gardens, stables and forges, dungeons and taverns. Even in the days of war with the aggressive Kent Regis, these had been kept safe. It was unlikely any threat would ever encroach upon the palace itself, unless one were to rise from within. While no one would go so far to call it unnecessary, this secondary stone curtain had become, at times, an object of derision, regarded among officers assigned to the watchtowers as merely a barrier shielding the king from bitter gusts of gossip. But for Stricia, This vantage point was still a thrill. She might not live within the palace walls yet, but her father's status as captain of the guard earned her family the same palace access granted to the guards. Since her father had never restricted her from the palace wall, she seized the opportunity whenever she could. At first, the watchman protested. She ignored them, keeping her distance. She busied herself with surveying the avenues below, hoping to catch housefolk in acts of compromise or conspiracy. This passion for surveillance troubled her mother. Ceresa was a quiet woman, more attentive to symptoms of illness than evidence of misbehavior, and she inspired gratitude from those in her care. She had, for a time, sought to teach Stricia the fulfillment that came from offering comfort and help. But the girl was repulsed by the sight of injury or deformity. The inconvenience of suffering unnerved her. Her father, meanwhile, inspired pageantry and allegiance. Wherever he went, Ark Robin's reputation preceded him, and he was received and honored for his power, experience, and the way he could compel obedience to the laws. To win Ark Robin's favor was to win freedom and respect from the king. And to win the king's respect, that would enable her to distance herself from the worries and trouble of ordinary housefolk. Once the king had chosen Stricia to marry Calraven, she saw the doors open to places that had enlivened her dreams for years. Here on the wall, the watchmen had abruptly stifled their complaints and applied themselves to pleasing her. This morning, troubled by the preparation for the day's prestigious event, Stricia wore one of her father's long rain cloaks, more to remain inconspicuous than to shelter herself from the intermittent showers moving over Abascar. On most days, she wanted to be seen, though she acted nonchalant and uninterested wandering along the wall. But today, she was expected to be at her family's side while they prepared for the rites of the privilege. She did not want to endure such a fuss. She wanted to watch the housefolk stream through the gate into the courtyard. She wanted to think about how many people would witness her grand entrance. She wanted to play out in her mind just how the pageant would proceed for the next big occasion, her wedding day. As the gates opened between this watchtower and the next, housefolk poured in beneath the entry arch and moved up the main avenue and spread across the broad green lawns toward the royal platform, which jutted like the prow of a boat into the courtyard. At the base of the stairs that descended from the stage, a circle paved with flagstones and ringed with torches marked the crux, the crucible where men and women would raise their pleas and learn their futures. The ring of decision. She would never stand there. While she fantasized, the two watchmen mumbled about their latest instructions. It was odd that there were two. It could only mean some possibility of trouble. Perhaps there was a conspiracy afoot, as rumors had implied. That dismal gray parade's going to trample the lawns, grumbled Carbalter into the breeze. And for what? Just to see a bunch of crooks plead for their lives and get sent back into the wild? You know why they're here. The metallic croak came from deep within the oversized helm of M. Emmett, his partner in watch. They'll obey the summons so they can earn another honor stitch. He knocked on his armored chest. They'll spend all day checking out how many stitches their neighbors have earned, and they'll boast to those who have fewer. Stricia scowled at the portly old guard, who was slumped on a stone bench as though he had died during a previous shift. The only Abascar event that'll ever warm my blood is the day the king declares Abascar's spring, Gives us back the rights Queen Geraldine took away. Emmet lifted the visor of his helmet to gouge a browning pear with the few teeth he had left. I've heard rumors about another rather momentous occasion, said Carbalter, bowing to Stricia. The housefolk are chattering about some kind of wedding. Have you heard these rumors, my lady? Stricia did not like Carbalter's vast forehead, his wiry bursts of graying hair, or his crooked teeth. She ignored his joke and turned back to survey the masses. We'll protect the wedding, don't you worry, future queen, said Carbalter. If the king has doubled the guard for this, you can bet he'll triple it for that grand occasion. He's doubled the guard, said Emmet, because he's hearing rumors of the grudgers. With a sudden flick of his wrist, the officer sent the pear's core hard and fast into the belly of a black-feathered bird that had settled on the edge of the tower wall. Feathers spun in the air long after the bird was gone. He muttered. That wasn't a gull. That was a mountain vulture. What's a mountain vulture doing here? Stricia watched a batch of young women pushing their way through the crowd, leaning into each other to gossip. She curled her hand into a fist. There's Danae, she said, not really caring if the watchman listened. Danae's a stuck-up little brat, calls herself a loyalist, but I've seen what she keeps under her blankets. She'll be losing some honor stitches soon if I have anything to say about that. And I will. Look at her, charming the boys, strutting and flirting. What has she done to deserve their attention? I'll put a stop to that behavior. Carbalter tweaked the medallion on the edge of his breastplate. It was a good day when I traded in my honor stitches for a suit of armor, and now I've got a medal. I got 4, Emmet choked, spluttering juice, clinking his medals against his breastplate. Blue level training, yellow level training, valor in battle, and archery. Now that's the sort of honors that really make people stand up and notice. He says he has a medal for valor in battle, Carbalter muttered to Stricia. What battles have you ever seen, Emmet? I earned that valor medal for killing 2 Kent Regis reptiles. Carbalter smirked. I heard Prince Calraven held the beastmen off so poor Emmet could escape, running like a goose with his tail feathers on fire. Calraven recommended that medal just to silence those who laughed at Emmet. A face emerged from the shadow of Emmet's oversized helmet, old and lumpish like a tortoise waking. I didn't run. I withdrew. You crusty old Von Nugget, I was injured. The aging soldier's outrage almost brought him to his feet. If he starts stripping things off to show his battle scars, Stricia laughed, I may just have to scream. I swear, Emmet continued, it was the worst of beastmen that had at us that night. But what do you know about combat? You half-drowned drunk. Look at that. Carbalter leaned out so far over the edge of the parapet, his partner could have ended their debate with an easy shove. Look, Emmet. The stocky guard groaned. Using his sword as a crutch, he managed to stand and share the view. Curious, Stricia edged up beside them. Looking south down the main market avenue, she could see across rows of tiled rooftops to Abiscar's outer wall. The road was thronged with housefolk. The noisy mass narrowed to push through the gates, where attendants quickly stitched a bright blue ribbon on each gray cloak for their voluntary attendance. Proud and pleased, they proceeded into the extravagant space where green grass grew, where striped flags flapped, to view the large stage with its swooping backdrop of red curtains and purple tapestries. They were elbows and shoulders against one another, crowding around the ring of decision like travelers warming to a fire. Carbalter turned his attention to one of the guarded underkeep stairwells. See him? See the ale boy? A child wearing an errand runner's cap had emerged holding a reflective silver tray aloft. He disappeared in the current of housefolk, then reappeared near the platform. He spoke to no one and moved independently, swiftly, with purpose. Stricia smiled. I know him. Clumsy little orphan. He's got enough goblets on that ale tray to serve more than the usual number of magistrates. There must be guests with us today. King Calmarcus is feeling generous. Carbalter glanced at Stricia quizzically. Shouldn't you be down there to be seated with your family? I suppose I should, she said, as if it were of little consequence. Today's kind of a rehearsal for me, you see. Soon, I'll be trumpets blared from a small platform to the right of the main stage. Drums thundered from a matching stand on the other side. On a smaller stage, at the top of the crimson fall of curtains, a group of white-robed singers began a bold inaugural verse. The crowd roared approval. The music of the rights of the privilege had begun and would continue throughout the proceedings. This fanfare, a bombastic and ancient motif, would course for several rounds before settling into festive strains of strings. The examination of orphans and gatherers would take place at the front of the stage. Only those housefolk standing near would hear the formal exchanges, and the rest would follow the progress by signal flags, musical cues, and the rapid ripples of gossip. This was all according to tradition. But now the three observers could see what made this year's ceremony unusual. From a doorway on one side of the courtyard, ascending from passages below ground, 14 men and women emerged, proceeding in bright sky-blue robes fringed with gold. Masks of similar blue concealed their faces, representing their roles as a unified force of law and guidance for Calmarcus's house. I had better learn the names of all the magistrates, sighed Stricia. They were followed by a company of tall, pale men and women in black uniforms and towering green headdresses. Belamican ambassadors, Stricia scowled. Ugh, they look like insects. I cannot tolerate Belamicans. They're always looking down on people. The magistrates and ambassadors walked to the platform through the crowd, moving in measured steps along a path that radiated from the stage and ascending the stairs on the left side. They crossed the stage, pausing frequently before what appeared to be an array of kings and queens. Like ghosts undecided about this world or oblivion, wooden figures wearing robes and crowns stood posed to appear contemplative and watchful. What the kings and queens used to wear back before the proclamation. Stricia did not bother to see if Carbalter was impressed. Someday I'm going to look through all the royal closets, see all the things they wore, the jewelry, the capes, the gowns. I like to imagine the food that was on their table, said M. Emmett. There he is, King Calmarcus. Stricia clasped her hands together. Ascending from the back of the stage, Calmarcus appeared among these standing tributes. He paused between the likenesses of his mother and father, their firstborn and thus the rightful heir, and took his place upon the throne, which brought a dutiful cheer from the housefolk. The cheer would have been more vigorous, Stricia thought, had they not already received their honor stitches. What if the masses cheered for her more loudly than they did for the king? It could trouble his temper. As the musicians and singers raised their voices in bolder tones, Stricia wondered if they were trying to mask the half-hearted ovation. How much he expects them to forget, Emmet muttered, turning his attention from Calmarcus to gaze upon the king's likeness that towered behind the musicians, a wooden sculpture carved from one enormous tree. Its eyes were level with the watchtower's parapet. The statue's right hand was raised, while the other hand clutched a scroll of laws. Its eyes were polished as smooth as eggshells. The lack of pupils, while a traditional style in Abascar art, had always bothered Stricia. It made the figure appear to be sleepwalking or blind. The king's likeness dominated the left side of the platform, but the statue on the right had been covered with an elaborate drape of colors, a single rippling veil, as though the hues that had been taken from the housefolk had been unraveled and woven into a single banner. In spite of the pageantry, Carbalter was still pointing to the progress of the ale boy and his tray of drinks. Calmarcus must be serving something from his best wine cellars. Probably some of the king's favorite drink there, too, he sighed. I'd serve a winter post here if I could just get me some of that wine. Stricia thought for a moment, then gasped. The bet! She turned and seized Carbalter's arm. I bet that wicked girl, Danae, that I would taste Hajka before there was a crown upon my head. You're rather ambitious, aren't you? Carbalter squirmed, and Stricia could see that her charms were doing their work. Well, there's no law against it, and no penalty for asking. No penalty, but the king's temper if we're caught sipping a drink prepared for him. And it's no secret that Hajka will punish the drinker with a judgment all its own. Aren't you a little young to be chasing dangers like that? Oh, it's only a crime if I drink this stuff. I just want to taste it. Surely you can help me, Watchman. How are you going to prove you've tasted it? Croaked Emmet. If you can get it, Stricia continued, her voice losing its humor, I will meet you at the gate after the rites, and I'll bring a cup. Then Danae can watch me take a sip. It'll be a barrel of laughs if we pull it off. Carbalter's smile faded. My lady, perhaps we should wait for another occasion. It's going to be tough to get hold of anything served on the platform, especially once the ceremony begins. Watchmen can't be drinkers, so I'd best keep my hands clean. There are guards all over the courtyard. Watchman, I'm going to be queen. And as queen, I'll have the opportunity to grant favors to those who make extra efforts to please me. I need to know those I can count on to carry out orders quietly, even difficult assignments. Color drained from Carbalter's face. I do not yet have a crown, but should you happen to find a way to help me win this bet, I promise I will remember you. My lady, playfully, she jumped at him, grabbed the hilt of the dagger strapped to his leg, and unsheathed it, just the way she often did when her father came home from a long day in the wild. He cried out in protest as she stepped away, and the blade came free. She had only meant to tease him. She had not anticipated that the dagger would have only half a blade, nor could she have guessed that wine would spill from the open sheath. She stood there, blinking in astonishment, while he knelt to wipe the red splash from his leg. My lady, forgive me. Emmet was laughing now, holding his sides until his laugh became a coughing fit. You see, my lady, he chortled, Carbalter is a dangerous watchman. Nobody dares threaten this palace for fear he'll throw wine at them. You'd best keep your hands clean, huh? Stricia took a deep breath. She extended the half-dagger back to Carbalter, but she held it fast when he reached to take it from her. Please, he said, his voice trembling, don't mention this. The nights up here can be long. I get thirsty. You smuggle wine to the watchtower without anyone the wiser, she said in a sing-song way. Surely you can wring some drops of Hajka from a clumsy errand boy. She released the dagger. My lady, he dropped to his knees, I'm just a tower watchman. I have no permission to approach the platform. You hear these horns? Stricia ran to the wall again and looked down. My father and mother are approaching. I'm supposed to be with them. With that, she was through the opening in the tower floor and descending as fast as she could run, fighting her way free of her father's rain cloak and lifting the skirts of her ceremonial dress to keep from stumbling. The hour had come when Abiscar would look on her with new appreciation, and she would at last begin to enjoy all she had worked to receive. Taking up the melody, two women drew a long arc bow across the rope-thick cords of the linfer, the chief instrument of the event. Their solemn refrain quieted the crowd. Housefolk drank in this view of painted spires and domes, shielding their eyes against the silver light that burnt through the sky's gray veils. Young men crossed their arms and strove to distract young women. Parents bent to scold talkative children. One toddler wailed, having stumbled, fresh blood on his knees, and his father, embarrassed, wiped it away. The congregated household pressed in close along the paths, while the celebrated families proceeded toward their reserved, slightly raised ground. Cheers rose in scattered waves as army regiments entered in rhythmic pace behind the families, hands on hilts, jaws set. There had been rumors, whispers of revolt. It would never happen, of course. No dissenter could muster enough strength and support to become a serious threat. They were sure of this. But still, under Ark Robin's strict orders, the soldiers were watchful. The drummers provided an officious march for the officers as they took their posts about the yard. Vaughns with jewel-studded saddles, carrying 2 riders each, were carefully guided, small eyes as expressionless as black coins. The children begged for rides, but the officers refused and sent them away with their heads full of sword fights. Some wanted to know Prince Calraven's whereabouts. He had been promoted from his rank as a troop leader to the station of House Defender, second only to Ark Robin. The soldiers reminded them that the prince was away on a mission to protect Abiscar's livestock, hunting a dangerous fang bear. The families settled into a space between 2 massive stone fountains. These new marvels, currently dry, would one day spring to life as giant pumps beneath the surface blasted water into the air, where it would fall into bowls on the corners of the platform. These were certain to impress the Belamican ambassadors and set them to imagining the future when a river would course beneath this house. Smug as thieves, Abiscar's housefolk would drink, bathe, and water their gardens, never needing to venture forth from the walls again. Some even said the water would bring Abiscar's spring. As Ark Robin's family entered, a murmur arose, for here was Calmarcus's chief strategist and captain of the guard. The captain's uniform jingled with medals. He waved his left hand to greet the people and kept his other hand concealed in a fold of his shirt. 2 fingers, the tale was told, had been ripped off by the jaws of a beast man. Middle-aged women, struck dumb at the sight of him, yearned to meet his gaze, just as young ladies had when he was a new soldier. His wife, Ceyressa, was in appearance his equal. Like him, she was tall, smooth-skinned, decorated in a seamless red-brown robe, as red as brown could be without crossing the forbidden line of Queen Geralaine's proclamation. And while she kept her hands calmly folded, her elegant robes proclaimed her a formidable figure, the most regal and influential woman in the house, still shapely enough to distract the young men, if only for a moment, from her daughter. To the eye, Stricia was the perfect balance of her parents, inheriting her mother's delicate complexion and grace, her father's piercing gaze and confidence. The observers hushed as Stricia waved a gleaming circle around her wrist, the bracelet of King Calmarcus's favor. This was the first public recognition of the royal choosing. The moment hung in the air as if the first firework of a royal festival had been launched. As the revelation swept through the congregation, they exploded into hurrahs. Even the musicians faltered, glancing up from their instruments to investigate the ruckus. Permitted at last to discuss what they had already suspected, the housefolk ventured their guesses as to the date of the wedding. Many nodded their approval that the king should bestow such an honor on Ark Robin's family. Meanwhile, Stricia reached down to accept wildflowers from a young girl who rode atop her father's shoulders. "She's come just to see you," the man shouted through the din. "You're the glory of our house. If only all our daughters could grow to be like you." The captain's daughter pressed her face into her flowers, and when she emerged, smiling, tears of gratitude were streaming down her face. That is the end of chapter 12, Stricia's View. Next time, Cup, Dagger, and Mask. And at the rate we're going, I will probably be recording that chapter in 2021, but we'll see how the week goes. Thanks for listening.